The Kane Chronicles, the first spin-off taking place within the Percy Jackson universe, and our first step outside Rick's Greco-Roman roots, was an interesting new adventure. While I liked it overall, it seems I've got a lot more criticisms of it than most of my hardcore Riordanverse-loving peers. Despite liking it overall, it was my least favorite of all the series. This video will be my overall thoughts on this series as well as my thoughts on each individual book, while also serving as a continuation of my ranking series. Though I should say, because I'm going over the series as a whole in this video, it will be a lot less spoiler-light than my previous ranking videos, but I still won't spoil too much about the book I'm talking about. So, if you have not finished the series, please stop the video when I get to a book you have not read yet. Now, let's get started. The first book, The Red Pyramid, starts us off by introducing us to Carter Kane and his, shall we say, complicated family situation. He was separated from his sister, Sadie, at a young age, with Sadie going with their grandparents and Carter going with their dad, Julius, who is a traveling archaeologist. But things get weird when Julius grabs both of his kids and takes them to the British Museum, only to unleash a seal on a bunch of Egyptian gods and blow everything up. The kids are understandably confused by all this, but their uncle takes them in to explain everything. The Egyptian gods are real, and so are the human magicians that channel their power. People born descendants of Egyptian pharaohs have the ability to use magic, and the Kane siblings and their parents are magicians. Some of the most powerful magicians in the world, in fact. Also, their dad unleashed a super evil Egyptian chaos god named Set when he destroyed the British Museum, and he's going to destroy the world unless the kids can stop him. But the Egyptian myth world is a bit complicated, with different factions of magicians that have different goals. Gods that interact with the world, some friends and some foes. Now that Set is free, the Kanes need to fight not just him, but other magical forces chasing them down, all while learning how to use their newfound powers and work together to save the day. So there's quite a few magicians in this world, and of course, most of them join an organization called the House of Life that fights and contains Egyptian gods. Because there's a lot of those, and not all of them are benevolent. Yeah, the Greeks and Romans had their fair share, but in Egyptian myth, there are a lot more minor gods likely to pop up and cause havoc. The magicians used to be on good terms with the gods and even work together to fight off a certain mutual threat, but as it is now, that's no longer the case. Now the magicians hunt down any god that steps out of line. To accomplish this goal, the magicians have a diverse array of powers they can channel. Elemental magic, which is exactly what it sounds like, though cheese is included weirdly enough. Transformation magic, which works on the self and the opponent. Combat magic, which encompasses the magician in an avatar that fights for them. Divine words, which apply the effect of a word to an object. Statuary magic, that can animate a statue to do the bidding of the magician. There's also summoning, mental manipulation, death magic, healing magic, divination, and sympathetic magic, just to name a few. There's also the Duat, which is like an alternate dimension where many gods, monsters, and demons dwell, which is beneath our reality. Magicians can travel to and from it, as well as store objects within. It isn't the best explained, but the magic system in the Kane Chronicles is great. It has a diverse set of powers that are all still comprehensible, and many of them work to the ideas of the power of names. Fitting, since those ideas were present in the mythology the series is inspired by. There's also specifically choosing the path of a god to follow. It all serves to encourage the reader to wonder what kind of magician they would be. Personally, I'd follow the path of Wadjet, with transformation magic into a vulture or snake along with fire elemental magic and possibly combat magic. One other aspect of the magic system is the Ba, or piece of the soul that, because Carter and Sadie are powerful magicians, occasionally leaves their body when they sleep and travels to important places, though functionally it's the same as the demigod dreams in the Percy Jackson series, a way for the characters to see something they would otherwise not be able to see. Now, in all of this, Carter and Sadie are in a unique position. You see, the magicians kind of need the way of the gods to fight off not just Set, but also a much greater threat looming in the distance. And they have a few gods already with them to help. Carter and Sadie have Horus and Isis respectively in their heads, who they need to figure out how to work with and learn the associated magical abilities of. And their family cat turns out to be Bast, the cat goddess, who's just the best. She's willing to be openly emotional with the kids, she tells them everything they need to know about the world and the various types of magic they can use, and she offers them refreshments after a particularly troubling monster encounter. The House of Life, seeing any gods binding themselves to humans as a threat, So the Kanes are on the run from not just Set and his forces, but almost every other magician in the world. It's a pretty bad time all around, even with the support they have. Moving on, this is the first Riordanverse series to have multiple perspective characters, Carter and Sadie Kane, two siblings who are both distinct characters and very entertaining to read, or listen to. Carter is serious, careful, and often holds back, but he pulls no punches when describing how ridiculous his life gets, or when he needs to make a move. Sadie, meanwhile, is far more sassy and self-centered, but she's open to growth and she does care a lot about the people in her life. Also, she'll occasionally say something like torch, or flashlight for you Americans, to remind the reader that she was raised in London. Most of the time they stay together, but there are times when they are separated. This book and this series is fairly balanced between the two overall. Unfortunately, now we come to my biggest complaint with this first book specifically, and that's the plot, or to be specific, the story structure. I'm really not a fan of the story structure in the Red Pyramid. At first. You see, the story really starts off when the siblings leave the establishment of magicians, but that takes quite a few pages and a bit of stopping and starting. After Julius Kane blows up the British Museum, the kids are taken in by their uncle, then a monster shows up, and a god shows up, and Bast stays behind to protect them. Then they go to the first gnome. Then, after getting the lay of the land, they need to flee because magicians start to suspect that they are hosting gods. Which they are, but, you know. This all comes together to form a stop-start rhythm for the first 100 or so pages of the book. Give or take. It really threw me off my first time reading the book, and since it was the first Rick Riordan book I'd read in years, I started to wonder if Rick had lost his mojo since Last Olympian. Thankfully, once Carter and Sadie escape the first gnome and rejoin with Bast, the real adventure begins. And, after those first 100 pages of this book, it's just as good as most other Riordanverse books, but they did leave a bad taste in my mouth. Even when I read the graphic novel version, which is much shorter. Most of the book is the Kanes going to a location to meet with an individual or find some magic object, and trying to get out without getting caught by the other magicians, or killed by a hostile god or one of Set's monsters. It may resemble one of the quests from the Percy Jackson series on paper, and in many ways it is, but there is one wrinkle to the formula added for this series. That being, even with Bast's help, they do need to start mastering their powers in order to fight off each encounter. It allows the reader to learn about each type of magic as the protagonists do, which works well for the much harder magic system that this series has. The climax of this book, for the most part, is great. It turns up the heat and has some of the most intense action in the Riordanverse, and it has some great character moments for the Kanes. Set is still able to pull the rug out from under them a few times, but the siblings still manage to push on and defeat Set, and it's freaking epic. My only complaint is that it kinda shafts Sadie as she doesn't participate in the battle that much, at least compared to Carter. Though the climax does end with a pretty clever twist, even though it won't surprise anyone who knows that much about Egyptian mythology, or grew up watching Stargate like I did. After everything wraps up, the siblings have a moment with their parents who aren't exactly alive anymore but are still around in a way. It's wholesome and bittersweet. A wonderful ending showing that the kids are alright and they've grown up a little. Now for the ranking, and an unfortunate decision I've got to make. Even though I enjoyed most of the book, the stop-start pacing of the first 100 pages felt super awkward since it felt like the plot was going nowhere. And again, I started thinking that Rick had lost his touch. While that turned out not to be true, the experience still left me with a sour taste in my mouth, which is kinda bad since this is the first book in the series. So despite enjoying most of the book, the Red Pyramid is going to be our first D tier. Let me reiterate that D tier doesn't equal bad, just least favorite for the Riordanverse, and even my least favorite books in it I still really like. It is my favorite series after all. I'd rather read the worst of Uncle Rick than the best of many other authors, even ones I like. And spoilers for a future ranking video, but it isn't the lowest of the D tier. But for now, let's get to book 2. Since the first book ended by explaining the framing device of the series, that being that it's a transcription of a recording that the Kane siblings made of the story that they then left for other magicians to find, this book picks up with the Kanes and a pretty sizable house of young magicians that they've been training in the path of the gods. But they've also been going out on missions trying to prevent the rise of Apophis, and looking for a way to revive Ra to prepare for the inevitable. Also, the main organization of magicians is out to get them as they believe the path of the gods is too dangerous. To start off, Carter and Sadie are searching for the 3 pieces of the Book of Ra. They are on a time limit since Apophis is set to revive in a few days, but Sadie still wants to celebrate her birthday, and she tries to spend the day with her friends, but is interrupted by a couple of gods who decide to possess her grandparents. Fortunately, she's rescued by a new ally, Bes, the dwarf god. Bes is the best. He's sassy, fun, capable, and loyal to a fault. He also has a history with several of the other gods, including Bast. Sadie is able to return home having learned a lesson about selfishness, and Bes joins Carter on the quest. The siblings split up, going on their own adventures, and we get plenty of sass for them both, but we also see both of them go to sleep and their Ba leaving their bodies again. What the Canes end up learning is that Apophis has a few of his minions infiltrate the House of Life and is helping them move against the Canes and Brooklyn House. Not good for a number of reasons, only one of which being another reason they need to hurry. On his quest, Carter eventually finds the tools of the Pharaoh, which are these crazy powerful weapons traditionally wielded by the Pharaoh. And he's got reservations about using them despite almost getting captured by the House of Life, just like he did with properly bonding with Horus in the first book. And just like in the first book, he has to learn a lesson about taking action when necessary, whether he's ready or not. This is Carter's primary character arc in the series, and it's one of my favorite aspects of it. Eventually, the siblings reunite and make their way through the Duat where Ra is. They find him as a crazy old man, but they hope that the journey will bring his senses back to him. Unfortunately, they fail to meet their deadline, and the gate to continue onward through the Duat is closed. Though since this is the Duat, their parents are there to console them, and they take the potential end of the world weirdly casually, though someone else comes along with a possible solution. Khonshu, the moon god, is here to play a game. Gamble for extra time, with a piece of their souls on the line. They succeed, but with a cost. Bes takes a fall, sacrificing a piece of his soul, leaving him basically brain dead. The siblings are pissed, but they press on. Fired up by the loss of their friend, they obliterate any demon that stands in their way. Now for the climax. After suffering a tragic loss, the Canes have enough time to reach Apophis. Tension is at an all-time high. They make it just in time to see Apophis start to rise. But there is some good news. Michael Desjardins, the head magician of the first gnome, is there too, and he's willing to team up with the kids, despite them technically being enemies, recognizing Apophis as a threat to all of them as an enemy of my enemy desperation. Unfortunately, even with the power boost the kids get due to their location in the Duat, it isn't enough to prevent the snake from rising. Desjardins is able to hold him down just long enough for the kids to escape with Ra, even if he still seems rather crazy. After fending off some magicians attacking Brooklyn House and getting Ra back in the sky for the first time in thousands of years, Carter and Sadie finally have a moment, and Carter gets his sister a gift. It's not much, but after what she just went through, Sadie appreciates it quite a bit. Now for the ranking. I really enjoyed this book, even compared to the best parts of the first book. The siblings had just enough time apart, good character arcs, the Duat was appropriately atmospheric, Bes is awesome, and the dynamics with the other magicians added a layer of complexity I thought was great. But there were some problems. Apophis awakening after 2 books makes the first attempt feel like a fluke, as opposed to Percy Jackson, where Kronos had multiple false starts across the first 4 books before coming back. I personally don't feel this was necessary, as Rick has shown he can write alternate ways of ancient evil on the rise, like what Heroes of Olympus, Trials of Apollo, and The Son of the Star had, but that's just a nitpick. Overall, it's the most complete package from this trilogy. As such, it gets the A tier. Absolutely worth getting through the false starts in the Red Pyramid for. With that done, only one more book remains. Discounting side novels, but that's a video for another day. For now, let's get to the Serpents Shadow. So the final book in the trilogy starts up, and things look pretty grim. For starters, Apophis is destroying tons of magician houses and is trying to get rid of anything the Canes could use to stop him. Carter, Sadie, and their best initiates are fighting their best, but all they can seem to manage is damage control even when they go above and beyond. To make matters worse, the magicians of the world are even more divided, with many turning on the House of Life, thinking the Canes killed Desjardins in the last book, specifically so they could get Amos to replace him. And Apophis's minions are still pulling their strings. So things are looking pretty bad, but there is hope. The Canes may have come up with a way to permanently defeat Apophis by performing an execration spell on his shadow. Thoth can't help with this, but there is a magician who dealt with such spells and could help them. So far so good, but they also want to do a test run with Bes's shadow to make sure the spell works, and possibly bring Bes's soul back. So Sadie goes with Walt Stone, one of their initiates, to look for Bes's shadow, And Carter goes with Zia Rashid, who had a copy of herself accompanying the Kanes in the first book, and is now here for real this time, to try and find Orpheus' shadow. I don't have too much to say about the former of the two excursions, beyond some things I've got to say about Walt, which I'll get to in a minute. The latter, on the other hand, comes with a huge catch. They need to take Sney with them. Sney being an insanely powerful, insanely tricky, and insanely, well, insane magician, ghost, who was supposed to be destroyed permanently, but they can't do it since they need him. He somehow knows that Sadie would show up, when she would show up, and exactly what he has to say to convince Julius/Osiris to let them go while holding the Feather of Truth. Even when bound by magic, it doesn't stop him from being a nuisance and trying to kill them repeatedly by manipulating some other force, since he doesn't care if Orpheus wins or not. So they have to keep thwarting his attempts and bind him back down, and after all that, he escapes even when the Kanes are able to get what they need. He's only around for this book and the two companion books, but he's honestly one of the best villains in the Riordanverse, and even one of its best tricksters, and the competition in that category is stiff. But despite everything, getting out of the Duat with a Serpent's Shadow is an uphill battle. Tons of demons and monsters surround the Kanes and their allies, but thankfully there's a pretty awesome scene in which the minor gods from the retirement home where they found Ra in the last book and a newly restored Bess charge forth to help them escape. But before I get to the climax, I've got a couple of things to address. I wasn't a huge fan of many of the characters in this series. I do like the parents and many of the gods, and I love Boston, Bess, and the two protagonists. But aside from Carter and Sadie, none of them had much if any depth. Desjardins was a decent antagonist, and Zia was interesting in the first book, but that turned out to be a fake Zia. And I never found the real Zia had enough development in comparison. The lone exception to this, for me at least, was Walt. Someone who wants to help despite the fact that his line is cursed with impending death. Something that he escapes, but still remaining devoted. Now, he isn't the best use of this archetype, even for this universe, but he's distinct enough. Though, speaking of him escaping that fate, unfortunately, we've now come to my least favorite aspect of this entire series. The ships. Sadie X, Walt, and Anubis is fairly self-explanatory. I didn't understand why Sadie was so off-put in general by the two of them fusing since her father isn't too far off, and it's not really a bad thing. But even beyond that, Anubis being thousands of years old means this is the first problematic ship in the Riordanverse. Yes, I know Anubis is a teenager by God standards, and he acts the part, but it's still weird. And that's without considering Carter X Zia. Just why? He barely knows Zia. The only time they really spent getting to know one another turned out to be a fake. There is no reason for them ending up together here. It just feels so forced. But thankfully it isn't too bad, and upon my reread, in quotes, with the graphic novel, it was a little more tolerable. So yeah, this book has some huge negatives, but I do have some huge positives, like the climax. I've made no secret of the fact that I've got a lot of criticisms of this series, more so than I usually do with the Riordanverse series. That said, I've also never pulled punches when it comes to aspects of the series I love. Now, I've been very critical of this book in particular so far, but now I've come to my favorite part of not just this book, but the entire trilogy. The Serpents Shadow has the best climax of the Riordanverse. Yes, I mean it. If I were to rank the climaxes of each Riordanverse book series, they'd look like this. Other series' final battles have their strengths, like the scale of the Battle of Manhattan and the epic duel in Tower of Nero, but Doomsday wins for me, not just because of how apocalyptic it feels, but because of how it brings everyone in. The Kanes and their allies are there, all the gods have shown up, paired off with their respective magician hosts. The minor gods, Carter and Sadie met in the Duat, have shown up, desperate to make something of their existence. Everyone who could come does, and it still feels desperate. Apophis is overwhelming, and even with all of their allies and gods, the Kanes can only slow him down. There's even a moment where Apophis manages to eat Ra, and is mere moments away from ending the world, and is only stopped by Carter and Sadie's last failsafe, the execration spell which finally banishes him for good. The events following Doomsday are super satisfying as well. Carter, for his actions, has gained the favor of the magicians present, and everyone is okay with him being the next pharaoh. Even Sadie, closing his character arc. Though he passes the position to Amos temporarily since he's still a teenager. The ships that I've given my thoughts on already come to fruition, for better or for worse. Mostly it's for the worse. And Sadie contemplates Sney running off, which will lead into the crossover. thus making Kane Chronicles the only major series that deliberately demands you read the side novels to get the whole story. And no, Heroes of Olympus does not count here. That series required very little context to understand the characters from the short stories, and they're explainable within the main series books easily enough, even if you've never read the Demigod Files. The Kane Chronicles has demigods and magicians as a sequel to an unresolved plot thread from the main series. Spoilers for a future video, but it is not very satisfying. Rick could just as easily had Sney in prison at the end of Serpents Shadow, and then have him break out at the beginning of Demigods and Magicians, but no. The resolution is still pretty damn satisfying, though. Now for the ranking. I'm glad I read this book, and this trilogy for that matter. It's unique among Riordanverse series in that it's the only series within it that isn't about demigods, and it has some unique elements such as the kids being on the run from the main magical establishment the whole time, and effectively having to build up their own faction. Plus, the magic system is really well explored, and offers a diverse array of abilities while adding to the world. There's also the fact that this is the only main series not centered on demigods, thus leaving the door open for the main characters to have two human parents with semi-normal relationships. I also love how unique the Egyptian gods are. They feel a lot more human since they aren't all powerful and they need a host in order to function properly, as opposed to the Greco-Roman gods who are kinda unrestrained and can just do whatever they want, in comparison. But unfortunately, the first book is bogged down by that first 100 pages, and this book is dragged out by having the overall worst shipping, forced relationships, and that plot thread about Sney being left open. Overall, the Serpents Shadow earns a C tier. Again, that C tier does not equal bad or even mediocre, it just means below Riordanverse standards for me, which is still head and shoulders above a lot of other books I've read. If you're a Percy Jackson fan and haven't checked it out yet, I recommend it. It's pretty unique as far as series in this universe go, and despite my criticisms, I'll admit it has plenty of its own strengths. But that's just my take. Next time we're looking at the Heroes of Olympus, so get ready for some massive highs and one massive low. If you've read the series, you know exactly what it is. I'm Kieran Mythos, and I'll see you all next time.